Welcome again to another session on culture and communication. We have been dealing with the issue of conflict, and in this session we're going to deal specifically with how Westerners tend to handle conflict. There are probably 5 ways, at least according to the research, that Westerners handle conflict, and we'll try to understand those 5 ways so that when you're dealing in a Western situation you can sort of detect what's happening here and maybe choose the best way of handling a conflict situation that you might at some point enter. Before we do that, I thought I'd show you this cartoon. The mother says, "You never knew your father. He was killed in a conflict resolution seminar." It's kind of sad on the one hand, kind of humorous in the other, but it does show how vicious sometimes things can get. And as Igor pointed out yesterday, when conflict gets larger and larger, it comes into war. But sometimes war can be between 2 people where they're fighting with each other, hopefully not to that extent. Before we get into definitions and so on, a little proverb: in conflict situations, strive for understanding before agreement. If you get agreement before understanding, you will have neither. You will have neither agreement nor understanding. If you have understanding before agreement, then you will be able to interpret the dynamics. You will be able to exactly understand how things have fit together. So in conflict situations, strive for understanding before agreement. Sometimes we're too quick to say, okay, now that's good, we're all finished, everything's clean, and you walk away, but maybe the understanding isn't there, and it's only a matter of time before the conflict comes back again. So a proverb to remember as we move through life. Now a definition of conflict. This is one that I use: the existence of differences which, when misunderstood or unresolved, create distance in relationships. So in almost all of my involvement in handling conflict situations, it's because of differences which people misunderstand, or differences which continue to grow and people try to avoid them, they try to ignore them, and all of a sudden it just bursts into some kind of angry, negative response. I have to say that other people handle the definition differently. They tend to say, and I think this is also true, and so you should know it, conflict is when you have competing goals, and those goals bump into each other. A very simple form of conflict where there's competing goals might be, I want to watch the football game on television. My wife wants to go down the street to hear a concert. And they're both at the same time. So we have competing goals, you see. And if I feel strongly about my goal, because it's an important football game, but she feels strongly about her goal because this is the only night this concert will be available to us, then how do you resolve? Well, that's a matter of difference, not right and wrong. There's not absolutes being involved here. So now it's a question of how do we handle this situation. So that is usually the definition of conflict, the competition, competing goals that we have to work through. And the question is, how do we work through those in Western culture versus other cultures? Well, we'll get into that. Now, we'll look at the dynamics of handling conflict. Dynamics of a conflict, and it's when differences emerge. This goes back to my definition. And when differences emerge, we have a potential conflict situation. There are some people that immediately, in recognizing that you think differently than I think, they believe they're right in the middle of a conflict. No, that's the potential of conflict. This is the time when we want to be wise. We want to know what our options are about how to move forward without creating a real conflict. So it's just potential. And if we understand that, that becomes very important in how we deal with it. When the mind begins to see that there's a potential conflict here, that you're thinking differently than I am or wanting something different than I want, all of us tend to apply a style of conflict management. How are we going to deal with this? What shall I do? What are the possibilities? Now, this is the most crucial part of the whole situation, but it's also almost always at the unconscious level. This is something we do without thinking. This is something that just happens back here and we move forward, and it's a default that we have based on our past experiences. So we just naturally, without any thought, move ahead and do something which has worked for us sometimes in the past. So we all apply a way of handling conflict. And that way will be determined pretty much by the cultural history that you have. And now one of two things is going to happen. Either the conflict is going to be resolved, that is somehow it's all taken care of and we walk away fine and in good relationship, or the conflict now becomes a real conflict and it's going to continue until something better happens. At this point then, according to my definition, if the conflict is resolved, we feel happy about the relationship and it's strengthened. We've come through a difficult or at least a tense situation. We've taken care of it. The bond is even a bit stronger now. However, if not, then the relationship starts to come under strain and stress. The relationship weakens. We begin to question whether they're truly our friend or truly committed. Or my wife might say to me, "Do you really love me?" You know, meaning if you really love me, you'd give up the football game and go to the concert. And I would say something like, "Well, this is the most important game of the whole season. That's for the championship. And why don't you just understand?" You see, now we've got this standoff. Now we've got a problem. The problem is worse. She questions my love. I question her loyalty to me, that she doesn't understand. Why don't you try to understand? Why can't you go to the concert alone, etc. So now we have this relationship that falls under strain. Now, resolution depends on three things, it seems to me. Which style of handling the conflict are you going to choose? In the West, we think there's 5. I'm actually going to give you a sixth one. Well, it won't be a sixth one. It'll be 5. One spins off. Then in the majority world, there are probably 7 or 8 different ways of handling conflict, all of them indirect, and therefore very difficult for Westerners to understand. But we're going to talk about the 3 most common ones in the majority world, and that will be in a future session. So which style is used? And that depends, are you in a more Western context or are you in a more majority world context? And if you're in a Western context, does it call which one of these 5 is most likely to give you a good, happy solution where we can both come out of this loving each other, caring for each other, being friends, etc. The second variable is how do you apply that style of conflict? If, for example, I say, "You never understand me." See, now that's not going to go well with my wife because the tone of voice, you know, there's a edge there. And then I use an absolute. "You never understand me," and of course that just creates defensiveness in the other person. My wife will say, "If you really loved me, you know, you wouldn't even think about going to the football game. You would want to be with me at the concert." And so now the way she does it, it puts me on edge, you see. And now, why do you have to think of this in terms of whether I love or not? It's not an issue of love, you see. And now we're debating. You see, it's happened so quickly. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen it with your parents. You've seen it in your own marriages. So how it's applied is very important. Either it encourages more conversation and more understanding and more possibility of finding a good solution, or if it's applied incorrectly, it creates defensiveness. And each of us now hardens our position. So that's very important. By the way, part of the how is also timing. If the other person has a hard day and comes home very tired and unhappy, that's not a good time to try to do conflict resolution. They just don't have the energy for it, and it's not going to work well. So the timing is also part of this, how it's applied. And then the third one is out of our control. It's how does the other person perceive it. So I might choose a correct way of moving forward in this tense situation, this potential conflict. I might speak kindly and graciously, and it is intended not to cause any defensiveness, but to open up communication, to clarify things. But maybe the other person is in no mood to talk. Maybe their position is to avoid conflict. So Muriel, at one point, felt that there was some distance coming between her and another woman. And she really liked this woman, this other woman liked her, the relationship had been good, but she felt there was some distance coming, just the feeling that you get. So she says, I wonder if we could talk for a few minutes about our relationship, because I'm feeling a little bit of strain there. Nothing serious, but I don't want it to get, oh, Muriel, don't worry about it. We're just like two ships passing in the night. It'll all come out in the wash. That's another proverb. In other words, don't worry about it. It'll be okay. Well, that's a way of avoiding conflict, just by sort of ignoring it, denying that any conflict is there. And at that point, Muriel realized that there was not going to be a conversation. And in fact, things went forward, but not really moving closer and having a stronger bond. So this is the anatomy or the dynamics of a conflict. And it happens to all of us. And we need to know that how these things emerge. It's also important to realize that when there's a potential conflict, everybody's choosing a way forward, but it's being done at the unconscious level. Now, let's take a look at the 5 ways in which Westerners tend to handle conflict. And you have this sheet of paper in front of you, and we'll look at it here and talk about it. Notice that there are numbers from 9 to 1 on the vertical axis, and also 9 to 1 on the horizontal axis. And if I were to give you a test, you would have some scores, and it would show where you score and which of these. And sometimes people score highest in 1, or maybe 2 are equally high. Sometimes all 3 are equally high, or even 4. Sometimes only 1 is very high. And if only 1 is very high, that means you have only one basic response to every conflict situation. I mentioned earlier that some people take a win-win position, a win-lose position. That is, I want to win in every conflict situation. And if you have to lose, that's because you're wrong. And if I have to win, it's because I'm right. I mean, why don't you just understand that and recognize that if I have a position, that it's because I've thought about it and I'm right. If your position is different, then you're wrong. And that's kind of how they go through life, proving themselves right and other people wrong. I'm going to talk about the damage that position does in families, particularly in a bit. Well, as we look at the vertical axis, the issue here is accommodation. To what degree do you accommodate to the relationship? That is, the relationship is the most important thing. So you do everything possible to keep the relationship intact. And so your major concern is strong relationships, not doing anything that would hurt the other person. And so if you look at the upper left-hand corner, here we have what we call the giving in position. That is, you give in to the other person when there's differences. You yield to them, same as giving in, or you accommodate. You say, well, yes, I think in most of the situations you're probably right, and I have no difficulty with that. And so you have these kinds of phrases that just smooth over potential conflict. You have, in this situation, the withdrawing or avoiding. You say, well, you know, different people have different opinions. I don't know if I've made up my mind yet. That's a way of avoiding the conversation. You haven't made up your mind, therefore you can't talk about it. Therefore there's no conflict. So you avoid or withdraw. I'll give some illustrations in a few minutes. Now the horizontal axis is the issue of assertiveness. And here the concern is for personal ideas, for your ideals, your goals, your values. What are the things that are most important to you, that are core to your being a human being, that perhaps are core to your being a Christian, your core to being a Russian, your ethnicity, and so on? These are things that you want to protect as much as possible. You don't want to compromise, you don't want to sacrifice as much as possible, and in some cases you may have to give your life for these core values if it comes to that. That might be the case. So the issue of assertiveness now is how much are you going to fight for these values, these goals, these ideals that you have. And so the person who fights long and hard for everything is this win-lose person. And so they're more concerned about being right, the 9, than they are about maintaining the relationship. So they're willing to sacrifice relationships for being right. This person who gives in and yields, his concern is primarily for the relationship and is willing to sacrifice personal goals and values and not worry too much about them. So there you have opposites in this way of handling conflict. So the win-lose person, and they see every situation as a competition. How do I win? How do I prove myself to be right? Sometimes those people have some very strong ego needs, we would say, but that's for another discussion. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you have the care-fronting position, the fourth position as we're going to talk about them. And this is sometimes called the problem-solving way. That is, we have a problem here, the football game or the concert. That's the difficulty. And so now, rather than taking a win position, I say, and my wife says, how can we talk about this? What are our options? How can we be creative so that both of us can win? It's also called a win-win position. Some people even call it the win-win-win position. I win and you win, which is always the best possibility. But when you and I win together, then God also wins. That's sometimes the way they think. It's also called collaboration, depending on whether you're in the corporate world or whether you're in a church situation. Now, I have to tell you that the care-fronting is added here because it came from a fellow by the name of David Augsburger. He wrote a book, Caring Enough to Confront. It came out probably 25 or so years ago, maybe 30 years ago. And Augsburger said that the only biblical way to handle conflict is one-on-one, face-to-face, confrontation, direct language, which is a very Western set of values, as we talked about. He says, furthermore, it's the only biblical way. Furthermore, it is universal for every culture in all time. Well, that was pretty absolute. And I've read the book, and his book has actually had become very, very popular. The difficulty is that in the majority world, if you use that style of handling conflict in a very straightforward way, you're going to make the conflict worse. I guarantee you, because I've seen it in a number of countries. For example, in Japan, the proverb there is that the back door of the church is as big as the front door. is bigger than the front door. More people leaving than coming in. And the reason they will tell you is because of the way in which Westerners have brought in the handling of conflict. And this is the style that they're insisting on. And before the end of next session, I think it's next session, we'll see how the two-thirds world people prefer to handle conflict and give a number of illustrations. At any rate, Augsburger wrote another book about 7 or 8 years ago, which was called Conflict Mediation Across Cultures, which in essence says, oops, maybe there's another way. And the role of the mediator, which of course is very good. Okay, and then we have the center one, which is compromise. And so often compromise is something that works. So my wife will say, well, I'll tell you what, you can use you can watch the football game, but then will you come to this concert with me 2 months from now and do that? I'll take another woman with me to go to the concert, you can watch the football game. Or I'll say to her, I'll go with the concert with you, but my friend wants me to go to this other football game in 2 weeks' time. And see, that's compromise. Both sides tend to give up something, but they also get something. And it's often the basis for labor negotiations, labor and management. We want this, and they're very parts, so they give up a little, they give up a little, and finally they come into a place where they are at peace with each other. Depending on who has the most power, you sometimes have a lopsided agreement, you see, because if you have the most power, you can bargain for more. So if you're into power in a marriage, for example, and you can threaten your spouse with, well, you know, I don't know if this marriage is going to last. That's a big threat, right? Then you're trying to control the other person, and you're trying to manipulate them so that you get your way. And I would say that would be, you know, the win-lose position again. So we can all use power. There are other things, dynamics like this, that enter into the situation.
Have you benefited from this teaching ministry? Have you found TVS videos helpful and relevant? Please consider supporting TVS with your prayers and financial gifts. For more information, please visit www.tvseminary.com.
Let's take a look at some of the items below now. I'll just do one or two, and then I'll give some illustrations. I'm going to do one or two items, and then we'll take a break and come back for some illustrative points. In this matter of, let's say, withdrawing. So withdrawing person, that's their style of handling conflict or avoidance. The assumptions inherent in this style is that differences are eternal. We're always going to have differences. We'll never see everything the same. They're inevitable, they're unchangeable, and differences are bad. So the more we can avoid them, the better we'll be, because there's just differences everywhere, so let's just ignore them. And we can live in peace if everybody just ignores them. There are times when that style of conflict makes sense, that style of handling conflict makes sense. If you have no power, why bother? In fact, sometimes if you have no power and you argue for something, there's a good chance that you could lose your job or lose the relationship. So there are times when it makes sense. Or if you're counting to 10 to cool off. Some of us have tempers. Some of us are impatient. Some of us are quick to say things and then we regret them later. If we can determine that this is one of those moments that we want to be very careful. Yeah, I want to say something, but I know it's not going to be good. So I say, it's time to take a break. Go to the bathroom. Do something. Get out of there. And it's kind of like counting to 10 to cool off until the emotions get back under control, and then you can re-enter the situation and you're not going to cause an explosion. You're not going to cause damage by what you say or what you do. So that's a temporary, or what we call strategic withdrawal. Strategic in order that we don't make matters worse. That's a good thing. That's the sign of a wise person. What if the damage of confrontation is too great? If you're going to lose your job, or that might be a time not to confront, not to express yourself strongly. Maybe that's a time to avoid conflict completely. My wife and I worked on the streets of Chicago for a year. We came onto the streets about 9 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and we were on the streets mostly trying to help people until about 3 a.m. in the morning. But the gangs are also on the streets at that time, and other people who are not kind, okay? So you want to be careful. You want to avoid conflict. You don't go up to a group of gang members and say, "Hey dudes, how are you doing tonight?" Well, no, just avoid conflict. Cross the street, go past them. The damage of confrontation is too great, or the issue is trivial. What's worth fighting for? Our son, one night, late afternoon, came home from college. He had his friend's car. It was an orange car. It was a clunker. It was bad. So he says, "Dad, my friend wants to sell me his car. $300. Don't you think it's a great deal?" And look at it. It's, orange, but kind of a hot rod, kind of a... And I says, and I'm saying to myself, "Oh my goodness, no, Mark, this is I wanted to say, take it back before it falls apart in the driveway." It was bad. And I thought to myself, "Oh, I can't do that because he'll feel badly. He already wants to buy it," and so on. So I thought, how do I do this now? So the issue is trivial. $300 in the span of life is not going to be good or bad. So I thought, this is not worth fighting for, but I'd like to help my son know how to make a decision. Can we make this a learning time? So I said, "Mark, what's that dripping underneath the car there?" He says, looks to me like it could be oil, Dad." I says, "Yeah, I think so. It's dripping there in my driveway." Is that bad? Well, I don't know exactly, but it could be a couple $100 to fix that. Maybe something less, but maybe even more. Okay. I said, "How are the tires look to you?" He says, "They're pretty bald, actually." He says, "How much tires cost?" "Probably $400 to replace all of them," or something. Okay. So I said, I pushed the car down and it went way down and bounced up. And I says, the shock absorbers is what I was testing. He says, "What are you doing?" I says, "Well, we want to test the shock absorbers, just find out how much it's going to cost you finally. $300 is a good price, but that probably won't be the end of it. But let's just think about this so we know what we're getting into." So we did a couple of other things. It was going to cost him about $1,000 to get it into, roadworthiness. So I says, "You've got the information you need now. Why don't you make your decision? We've talked it over. It looks like a nice car. I think you could be proud driving it and everything. But the dollar signs now were going around in his head, or the ruble signs in your case, and he didn't buy it. But you see, I could have stepped right in and says, "Mark, that's not a good deal." But that would have kind of caused him to feel badly. And you said, "Dad, I really like it. Why are you against it?" Kind of thing. And immediately it would have caused strain. Well, let me quickly do the win-lose position, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back, and if you have some comments, we'll talk. In the win-lose position, differences are black and white. There is no category of difference. Everything is either right or wrong, black or white. And someone is right and someone is wrong, and differences need to be erased. That is, differences shouldn't be allowed to exist. We want to know who's right and who's wrong, therefore that's a value that this person has. Now, under what conditions does it make sense to take a right or wrong win-lose position? Well, if time is short, important decision, then somebody has to make a decision. or if ideas are of crucial importance. Okay, so now of all of these ideals up here, you have them. Which ones are you going to fight for? Which ones are you going to take a win position for and say, I'm not going to compromise, I'm not going to negotiate, this is an absolute for me? Now I'll tell you what I told when I was teaching undergrads at Wheaton College. It's one of our fine Christian schools in America. And I said, what do you fight for at your age? 18, 17, 19, some of them. And I says, one of the things that you ought to fight for is your virginity. That's worth fighting for, because there's a lot of the sexual revolution, all that kind of stuff going on. And, you know, anyway, the context required that. It just seemed right to say that kind of thing. Are you going to fight for that? How is somebody going to try to persuade you otherwise? How are you going to deal with that when it happens? What's worth fighting for? What issues, what priorities, what goals, what values do you have that you don't want to give up? Because if you do, the cost will be too great. You'll sacrifice something that you won't be able to recover. So when ideas or values or goals are of crucial importance, you want to take a win position. And then lastly, you go for a win position because you don't want to take advantage. If somebody's trying to take advantage of you, if they're trying to get you to do something or go somewhere or whatever, and you just don't feel that that's the right thing for you to do, and they're trying to manipulate or control you, that's when you take a win position. You say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. And if it costs you the relationship, there are some things that you say, if you're going to make me forfeit the relationship, then the relationship is not very good, not very healthy in the first place. I'm going to choose my values and my priorities. So all of us have to be doing that somewhat on a regular basis, but then we have to train our children how to do that too, and help others, the youth in our church, for example, young adults, young married couples. How do you manage these life situations? When we come back, we'll take a closer look at these 5 styles with some illustrations. We'll have some conversation about how things work in your culture, and we'll move forward on this.
Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 10, 11. How to give to TVS Ministry. You may give online at efca.org/givenow. In the description place, write Russia Distance Learning, account number 24109-0150. Or make checks out to EFCA. Write on the check memo line, Russian Distance Learning, account number 24109-0150. Mail to EFCA Donor Services, 901 East 78th Street, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 55420-1300. Or send your gift through PayPal for tvs.gift@gmail.com.